Analytic Idealism, the creation of Bernardo Kastrup. What might the problem be? Let's take a look. I've done a couple looks at Bernardo Kastrup in his framework of idealism. He has a very large following, and it's growing. His channel is like Essentia Foundation, 182,000 subscribers. Bernardo Kastrup channel, 29,000. By the way, that look was in number 41 in 2019. Fairly extensive look at Bernardo's theory. The growth, the popularity I attribute to the current frustration with raw materialism, that somehow mind just comes out of matter. And secondly, to a lack of awareness or understanding, in any case, of a very much more powerful theory, namely Bergson's. For Bergson aims precisely for a common sense intermediate ground between these two poles of idealism and realism, which are always oscillating in our thought and philosophical theories and are seemingly irreconcilable. Now, I put AI there on the realism side because it is a form of indirect realism. The cup outside the computer there is considered to be quite real, quite physical, but it's only a representation in the AI. That's the cup as far as the AI is concerned. It's not the cup directly where it says it is out on the kitchen table. It is direct perception, but it's a form, at least, of realism. The cup is real, physical. So Bergson is the intermediate ground between the two. So I watched with interest Bernardo's explanation here of the variance of idealism in this particular YouTube, fairly recent. Variance of idealism and where he and his analytic version fits. Did he make things better? Well, let's take a look. So there's several flavors of idealism as on the menu there: subjective, objective, Kantian, Schopenhauer, and Bernardo's analytic. Bernardo starts with subjective idealism, the flavor everyone understands, Bishop Berkeley's. To be is to be perceived. Perception is the reality. There's nothing behind the perception, like a brain. The cup, a physical cup, anything physical. Does a tree fall in the forest if no one's around? For Berkeley, well, doesn't matter. God sees it fall. All is mind. In other words, to be is to be perceived. But just an observation I'll start making all along the way. We have no idea what perception is in this model. Then onto objective idealism. That is, perception is representational. The contents of our perception represent something behind our perception, which modulates them. Okay, so there's something behind the perception of the cup. Something's there that causes or is behind the perception of the cup. Bernardo notes Tononi, things only exist if they exist for themselves. So this is part of this flavor. Something can exist if there is something it is like for it, whether something is perceiving it or not. I see that later in another spot, Bernardo will say that, well, the cup doesn't have something for which it's like, but the whole universal field, then we're talking something different. Then there's something for which it's like, the whole universal field. So in this framework, there's a world out there independent of perception. To be is not to be perceived, to be is to have experience. And that world presents itself in the form of what we call physical stuff, what we touch, hear, taste, smell. So it's not really physical stuff. Apparently the real stuff is actually consciousness, experiencing stuff. The cup is somehow experiencing stuff, but yet only because it's in the vast universal field, apparently. What scale of time, one wants to ask, does this stuff, for example, the cup, exist? That is, as he says, present itself. Remember, I've noted before, the Minkowski diagram, space-time manifold, has no particular scale. It can be an ensemble of quarks, that cup, a bunch of electron clouds, also the cup, a stable cup and spoon as we perceive. It could be a radioactive decaying cup before our eyes, disintegrating. What is selecting the scale? Is the whole universe is all possible scales, and yet it's all a thought. So thoughts at all possible scales? Just interesting question. Does the brain have anything to do with the selection of a scale? So far, we still have no idea what perception is, and worse, what, if anything, the brain does. So we come to Kantian idealism. It's primarily epistemic, relating to knowledge, or to the degree of its validation, as Bernardo says. We can't know what reality is, the famous thing in itself per Kant. We can only know the phenomenal. We don't know the totality of the cup in all its relations within itself, and to the external field. We can only know the image, the phenomenal image of the cup. Now, this is one of the places, many places, where Bergson differs from Kant. Bergson would say we can know this thing in itself, via intuition. For example, his famous example of the wasp and the caterpillar. How does the wasp know the 9 precise places to sting, plus a head twist, to paralyze the caterpillar, so it's alive yet motionless for its young? So he says, thus the instinctive knowledge, where instinct is simply a form of human intuition, but in the animal world, the instinctive knowledge that one species possesses of another on a particular point has its root in the very unity of life, a whole sympathetic unto itself. Elsewhere, the wasp and the caterpillar are considered no longer as 2 organisms, but as 2 activities, 2 processes. That is, the wasp and caterpillar are not separate, distinct objects, but rather 2 processes or flows within the field. I discuss aspects of this also in Cormac McCarthy's Stella Maris book on mathematics, the role of intuition. But the question is still, but how do we even get the image? This would be right back to the hard problem. And there's no answer in Kant. So then there's Schopenhauer's idealism. Schopenhauer, for Bernardo, says we do have access to the noumenal, that is the thing in itself. His example, I see my body in the mirror, but I feel it. I feel it breathing, walking, pain, feeling, etc. The phenomenal content corresponding to my direct noumenal content is material. Unless you ascribe, Bernardo notes, to an arbitrary discontinuity, the whole material world is like this. So, matter is the representation of mental states. And we're back to this. Real stuff is consciousness, experiencing, mental states. There isn't physical stuff. Now, I would say, this is firstly our affect, this example that Schopenhauer is talking about, is not direct intuition of the cup as the thing in itself, or direct intuition of the caterpillar for the wasp. The basis of Bergson's intuition and Schopenhauer's claim here is very different, and we'll see that shortly. For that the phenomenal content is material and matter than just a representation. This is indeed just a claim, a mere stipulation, in my opinion. But we come to analytic idealism, Bernardo's. He notes, Schopenhauer didn't address why there's this separation between me and the world. Why can I access my noumenal contents directly, but not yours? If he had just taken the next step, that there is dissociation and the unity is lost, and that's why we seem to be separate from the world, he would have completed the job. And this is Bernardo's picture on the right here. The TWE, that which experiences, or the field of consciousness of God, apparently. Each of us, in his terms, alters, are dissociations within the whole, which is kind of why we bring in Freud here, because it's essentially split personality. The whole is, the TWE is splitting into multiple personalities. So dissociation is his mechanism for achieving individual experiences. Now, note that little box in the yellow. Universal phenomenal consciousness is all there is. Everything else in nature being reducible to patterns of excitation of this consciousness. So the brain is equally an excitation of this consciousness? How does the brain account for the image of the cup? I've seen in a comment, and I'm not sure that this is Bernardo, I'm not sure Bernardo said this, but let's take it as a given, that Bernardo's thesis is the brain doesn't generate consciousness, it filters and localizes it. So what does this mean? The brain filters what's already a phenomenal thought, apparently, of a coffee cup out there on the table, into a phenomenal perception of the cup out there. Well, how? What is the thought now in the neural mass of the brain? Are we not right back to the hard problem? We've now transformed the thought into the neural mass of the brain, and now we have to get the thought back out as the phenomenal coffee cup. Maybe worse, why does a TWE need brains at all to account for experience? Why isn't the whole? Remember, the brain is equally an excitation. The whole of reality is just an excitation of the TWE. It's a little bit mysterious to me. And the excitations just happen to be coffee cups, spoons, buzzing flies, not electron clouds or clouds of quarks or heron-like flies. One wonders, can one really do science in such a framework? Because we can appeal to the TWE to explain anything. Just a question. This is the impasse. Realism starts when the physical world is the only reality. It then tries to derive consciousness. It cannot do so. Witness the hard problem. Idealism starts from consciousness as the only reality. Then it tries to derive the physical world. It just struggles to account for the commonality and sharing of experience. And we'll look into that a little bit more as we go along here. And the laws of the nature, the order of science. It cannot do so. What's realism's core problem? That which Bernardo is reacting to. Well, the core problem, which Bernardo never notes, is the classic metaphysic of space and time, I've noted before. There we have a picture of the concrete, ever-transforming world assumed by realism. But over it, we place an abstract space, an infinitely divisible space, a principle of infinite divisibility. It's conceptually imposed. The abstract 3D continuum of points, positions. And time becomes the fourth dimension, the dimension of instance, corresponding to each position of a motion. We move the cylinder from A to B, and we consider to have traced a trajectory of points. It's infinitely divisible trajectory of points. So this is an infinite regress. Remember, it's infinitely divisible. Between each pair of points, to account for the motion, we need a new line of points, ad infinitum. And it's an absurdity, because we're treating motion as a set of immobilities. So it's both an infinite regress and an absurdity. And in this metaphysic, there's ever only one discrete state, instant, where each state of that motion of the cylinder corresponds to shall we say, a block of space-time. My block's there. But each cube, my little cube, has a time extent, logically, at the end point of this operation of infinite division of a mathematical point. So there can be no experience of continuity. Each state, each cube is gone as the next arrives. There can be no experience of continuity. All of this is an ideal limit, never reached in the concrete world, this classic metaphysic. It has no positive reality, no ontological status, but this metaphysic is the basic framework of our science. As I noted, for Bernardo, unaddressed. So as a space, our cube's there. When its time extent is taken to its limit, as I noted, it's a mathematical point. So each cube is utterly homogeneous. So thus it's a space and time stripped of all quality to include qualities of motions, like the opening and closing of the rose, or any other quality, because all quality is actually a function of time. The brain is necessarily part of this homogeneous space. Thus, the origin of the qualitative image of the external world, the hard problem, our experience becomes an unsolvable dilemma. Hence, the ricochet to idealism. We assume consciousness. We assume experience. What would satisfy idealism? Well, my consciousness of matter must be no longer subjective, as in English idealism for Berkeley, relative, as in Kantian idealism, and mute. Our theory of consciousness at least cannot be mute on the relation of the brain to experience, as is the problem with all idealism to this point. Not subjective, because it is in things rather than in me. Not relative per Kant, because the relation between the phenomenal and the thing, our coffee cup there, is not of appearance to reality, but merely of a part to the whole. Consciousness in things rather than in me, the phenomenal as the part to the whole. How can this be? Well, for Bergson, as we've discussed, the universe is conceived as a holographic field. The state of each point in such a field reflects that of the state of every other point. So when you think about it, thus defined throughout is an elementary awareness. Elementary because it would be what I call the null scale of time. That is the smallest, most minute scale of time imaginable. A scale that looks nothing like buzzing flies, stirring spoons, coffee swirls, etc. The field is transforming indivisibly. It's not a series of discrete states or discrete instants or a series of little cubes. It's transforming as a melody, a true continuity. Thus, as a property of this transformation, there's implied an elementary memory. Each instant is not disappearing into non-existence as the next instant arrives. Each state not disappearing. So throughout the whole, there's an elementary perception, at this most minute scale of time. So this becomes the question, not how perception arises. It's already in the field, defined throughout the field, but how perception is limited. So we continue with the holographic metaphor. For holographic reconstruction, we're driving a reconstructive wave with a certain frequency through a hologram plate. And then they're specified, the object wave rising to the eye is specific to its source. In this case, a cup. The object wave associated with that frequency 1. I could modulate that. Let's make it frequency 3. Now they're specified a cube, that which was tied to the reconstructive wave, or the original frequency of frequency 3. So we can modulate this reconstructive wave to specify different images. So in the Bergson model, the brain is acting as a modulated reconstructive wave, passing through the hologram, the holographic field. And it's specific to a source within the field. For example, the coffee cup and the stirring spoon. The cup is specified as an image. It's specified right where it says it is, within the field, as common sense says, not in the brain, not in some strange perceptual space or mental space, which is a nice go-to for an excuse for a model of the image. And it's specified as a part, an aspect of the whole. The cup specified as an image, as not the thing in itself, not the cup in itself with all its relations to the external field, but necessarily as a part to the whole. That part being an image. That's the nature of an image. So this would be our second bullet, the phenomenal as the part to the whole. Now the invariant structure of the event, the dynamic structure of invariance laws, this is driving the modulation pattern. You have velocity flow fields, adiabatic ratios, inertial tensors. This is the variance laws described by ecological psychology in J.J. Gibson. It's driving the modulation pattern of the reconstructive wave. But this structure of laws is why multiple folks share the same experience. The rat and Snow White there see the same coffee cup being stirred. In Bernardo's framework, it's just the TWE, that which experiences, driving the sameness for all of the alters. For there to be laws, such as the coffee cup, that would be just an attempt to kind of allow for the fact that there seem to be laws, when it's truthfully not really necessary for the TWE. So this is the basis for the sameness in this model. And again, it sort of relates to why it's difficult to do science, in my opinion, for Bernardo in the idealistic framework that he's describing, because, well, you really don't need laws. So the brain's chemical dynamics. There's a chemical dynamics underlying this wave. That specifies the scale of time. For example, our normal scale, the buzzing fly. The higher the oscillation of the neural mass, the slower the scale of time. I've argued elsewhere, in fact, in academic articles, that LSD acting on a certain receptor affects this raising of the vibrating frequency of the neural mass of the brain. So the higher the rate, the slower the experience perception. We might now have a heron-like fly barely flapping his wings. So yes, the brain has a definite role in this model. Now, there's no truly distinct spatial separation within this field. There's no truly distinct outlines or borders, say, between the rat, Snow White, the heron-like fly, the cup, etc. The borders are really a function of the scale of time that we dwell in. If we went to a lower scale of time, we begin to see the field as a whole with no real distinct outlines. So this relates to Bergson's principle. Questions of subject and object and their union and their distinction must be put in terms of time, not space. What do you mean by this? Well, start with the body and the fly as ensembles of quarks or maybe electron clouds. Transform the scale of time. That is, lower the energy state affected with the brain's oscillating, vibrating neural mass. One might start from a quark ensemble, and then from the fly would become a cloud of electrons. By the way, the body is also in the same state, which the body would be a cloud of electrons too. Body and fly, cloud of electrons, obviously not really distinct within the field. But as we transform, the fly would become a crystalline, vibrating structure. Then a motionless fly, barely flapping its wings, stock still. Then a heron-like fly, a motionless fly without flapping its wings, and a heron-like fly, barely flapping its wings, and the buzzing fly of normal scale. So subject, in this case, is differentiating from object, not in terms of spatial separation. The spatial union within the field is not being broken, but it's separated in terms of time. The objects are pulling apart as they're specified at this ever larger scale of time. The specification of the image, then, when you think about it, is equally to a time-scaled form of the elemental awareness we already discussed, defined throughout the field. Buzzing fly, coffee cup are simply a time-scaled form of this awareness. So this is the first bullet, consciousness in things rather than in me. The perception is to a state of perception of the field. Now, to integrate affect within this framework, see my number 59 on Souls and Feeling, which is in 2021, or my Challenge to AI book. Much more discussion there. So the body is the invariant in the ever-changing matrix of experience here. Identity settles upon it. This is the mechanism in Bergson's framework for the, quote, dissociation, the separateness of each of us that Bernardo's trying to explain. And of course, this can be broken. A Zen practice, like a Zen koan, you can break this conceptual framework where the separation is perceived constantly and is suddenly no longer perceived, and one, yes, becomes the fly, the coffee cup, etc. all this unified field, shall we say, this framework of subject and object, is the basis for Bergson's intuition, where we have two processes for the wasp and the fly, not two separate objects, but two processes two flows within the field, in the transforming field. This is the common sense intermediate, things indeed where we see them, a role for the physical, the brain, and physical laws. Bergson, well, someone ideally, quote unquote, that Bernardo should consider. So take a look at this book for much more detail on this subject, Bergson's framework, Gibson, problems of artificial general intelligence. So we'll see what goes next time. Till then, signing off.